Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Friday edition of the Pandemic Podcast, where I make the statement it's time for solutions. I think many of us will agree that the response to COVID-19 itself has caused a multitude of issues in addition to the problems caused in terms of the health response to the virus and the impact it's had on people's lives and their health. In this episode, we're going to focus on perhaps both elements, because the reality is what we're experiencing as a society, as humanity, is a complex set of problems. If you take the virus itself as an issue and the impact that it's having on the world, that is a problem that needs tackling. But so are the related issues that have come from the response, from the collateral harms that we've seen as a result of policy, whether that's the record hospital waiting list, whether it's the disruption to education, problems with mental health, the economic recession, the loss of livelihoods and business closures, the lack of socialization and isolation that we've seen, and all of these different issues. And now we've got new issues that are emerging, some more social and cultural and ethical issues around discriminatory vaccine passports, for instance, which really threaten not only liberties but really the prospect of dividing society and excluding people from products and services and travel, through to recently discussed in the press the prospect of childhood vaccinations without parental consent. All of these issues are real issues, and when we face such a multitude, a complexity as this, it can become quite overwhelming and quite intimidating. One of the things I want to touch upon in this episode is how we can take the fear of a future reality, the fear of a future projection of what could occur, and allow it to empower us in the present moment and to enrich us in the present moment. Because the reality is, for many of you who have been following the Pandemic Podcast, examining some of these issues, it can be quite painful. It can be we can feel quite isolated because it seems like the majority of people are unaware of a lot of these issues or unwilling to look at them. So it can be very, very challenging. And the problem is, when you spend all your time looking at issues and problems, it can have an adverse effect on our own mental and emotional health. And that's why I say now is the time for solutions, because the reality is we are becoming more and more aware of what the issues are that have gone before us. We can't change directly the past, but we can learn from the past, and we can also look at how we can heal from the past and solve some of the problems that have gone before us. But before I get into the kind of talking of the fear of a future reality, I do want to touch upon what I see to be a potential onslaught of problems. Sorry, it's Friday afternoon. I try and usually end on a high, which I will do, and I've only got a short period of time to cover this episode, to have a meeting at 5:30. But really, what looking forward in terms of what's coming down the track, we know the prospects of vaccine passports. We've already seen them in other parts of the world. There's footage from France already where the police are walking around cafes and restaurants, literally checking people's papers. I heard a story this week of an old lady in Cyprus who was unable to go to the bakery because she didn't have her papers in order. Seeing people eating in the streets outside the restaurants in different parts of the world where they've been forbidden from accessing the services because of their medical records. So the vaccine passports are one issue, but we also have the issues that have been discussed at the beginning of this episode around childhood vaccinations. Many are concerned on a safety record in that regard in the first instance, but more broadly than that, the idea that these could be given out without consent, without parental consent, is a deeply concerning prospect for many. We've also got the fact that we've seen waning immunity within the vaccines, even though this has been documented in many different scientific papers. Even saying this on social media risks this broadcast getting taken down. So we have the issue of censorship and deplatforming, which is a very real issue because it doesn't allow scientific debate. But we have that issue, and as a result, we've seen these breakthrough cases. Israel should be a warning sign. Gibraltar should be a warning sign. And unfortunately, again, sorry, Friday afternoon, but going into winter season, we know that seasonal viruses are typically worse during winter months. People are moving less, they are getting less vitamin D, their immune systems take their toll in the winter. So as a result, we have to expect that we're going to experience more challenges from COVID-19 going into the winter, which offers potentially the prospect of further lockdowns. There is a potential that other mutations in the virus could occur, whether naturally or as a result of the mass vaccination campaign. There's a whole host of issues that could come. And the reason I said it's important not to allow the fear of a future projection. These things are merely projections. They are quite likely projections as it stands, but not all of them. None of them are guaranteed, and some of them can. The things that, such as policy, lockdowns, vaccine passports, mandates, consent, etc. All of these things are within our control. What the virus does is not within our control. That's nature. But the virus itself is a problem that we need to look at how we tackle. But when we look at all of these problems, many of the problems we're facing now can be stripped down to consequences of policy. And the future problems may also be consequential from policy, whether that's lockdowns, vaccine passports, vaccine mandates, the lack of informed consent. But what's important here, in order to come up with solutions, is we take these projections and we bring to the present moment reality and allow it not, the problems aren't going to enrich our life, but actually bring it to the present moment to become empowered to look at the issues individually and collectively and try to understand how do we actually overcome these problems, because there's all kinds of ways we can approach this, but in many ways, in order to solve the problems, we have to get to the root cause and we have to try and find commonalities. And what's very interesting with all of these policies, whether that's lockdowns, digital surveillance, vaccine passports, digital IDs, vaccine mandates, erosion of informed choice, they're all examples of government overreach. Okay, so when we can see that, we can see the commonalities that we here have a government that is interfering on a level that would not normally be expected in people's lives. Now, there's a secondary tier problem to that, is that there are different ways that people respond to government intervention. We know societally, culturally and socially, that some people are natural leaders, some people are natural free thinkers, some people are naturally independent, whereas others typically prefer to follow. It's not that they're not independent thinkers necessarily, but we do know that we have many people like to follow the rules and follow the guidelines, and for a lot of people it brings certainty and security, and rules and guidelines for many do bring that sense of certainty and security, and we have to recognize that certainty, security and safety are basic human needs. So for some, as we've seen, some will welcome that government intervention because it makes them feel more secure and safe. But that only happens in a condition whereby fear in the first place has created a sense that they do need these rules and regulations in order to feel safe. And that safety is often, the perception of safety itself is often an illusion, as is the fear. They say fear stands for false evidence appearing real. So in many ways, what we must first do is get clear on what the problems are. And that can be very, very hard. That can be very, very hard because right now there is a whole multitude and complex levels of issues. And I've spoken to many different campaign groups. You've seen the Together Declaration this week, focused on vaccine passports. I've just spoken to a group who are looking at issues around vaccine adverse reactions. I've spoken to someone this week who's looking at the prospect of childhood vaccinations and the issues surrounding these things. And we've got lots of people working on solutions in different areas. The difficulty is how we get to the root cause and how we start to form compelling solutions that people can get behind. Because when it comes to policy decisions and excess government intervention, it really does take public intervention to course correct and recalibrate that government level of intervention. And when we can see it in that way, we can then start to explore solutions. Now, I'm not going to look at specifics in this episode because we don't have the time to delve into it, but I think the human creative spirit has demonstrated throughout history that it is entirely capable of overcoming great challenges and great problems, both on an individual and a societal and planetary level. But that can only be really done when we are not living in fear. So that's why I make the point around we can look at what could come down the track, and it's important to do that to anticipate the road ahead. But we spend our time, once we've identified the problem, looking at what the solutions can be. And there's two sides to this, particularly in this kind of policy intervention type space, is that on one hand, there is resistance, resisting non-compliance, for instance, looking at different ways to challenge or resist policy or potential policy on one hand. But on the other hand, there is proactive, creative solutions. And I do feel that at this point, we need a bit of both. The reality is right now, we've got the issue with COVID-19, which has generally caused a lot of these responses that we're seeing, some of which are opportunistic, that have been waiting in the wings for a long time, like vaccine passports as a precursor to digital IDs. If you look at any industry report in the business analytics space, you'll see that digital identifications are a multi-billion pounds industry in the making. That's long established, for instance. Similarly, pharmaceutical companies, like any business, they require supply and demand. There's much greater demand for pharmaceutical problems in the face of a health crisis. So naturally, it's an opportunistic moment in time for those industries. So we have those components, but we do need to then think creatively. If we've got a problem, a health problem, how do we, rather than separating into sides, pro-lockdown, anti-lockdown, how do we look at the issue with the virus and start to think about what is the problem and what is the solution? Because at the moment, we've just followed one track, excess government intervention, excess human intervention, and it's only caused more problems. Now, it doesn't mean we just rely on nature necessarily, although that is an option and it should be considered as a solution. But we look at together, how do we solve this problem? But we also now need to look at these wider cultural, ethical, social problems that are emerging and come up with solutions, because vaccine passports, they may have malintent, but at the end of the day, partly it is about looking at reopening society. So when we look at the objective of reopening society and the problems that are in the way of that, we have to look at what is a creative solution to overcome the potential risks that emerge. So we've got the practical viral elements of coming up with solutions, because what's evident is that the current set of solutions are causing more harm than good. Therefore, we do need to be smart. We do need to be innovative. We do need to get our creative thinkers to think about how we tackle this. But then also importantly, as I said, we need to look at solutions in terms of policy. So you've got number one, resistance, activism, for instance, which can take the form of protests, campaigns, letters, petitions, boycotts, strikes, other forms of non-violent civil disobedience. There is, Gene Sharp has written 198 ways to take non-violent action towards affecting change. So you've got the resistance part, but then we've also got the creative solution making. Take government excess intervention firstly as a problem. Let's look at that. We've got this paternal type relationship with the government, and at the moment the government is basically behaving like an angry, authoritative parent who's banishing the bad child to the room and not allowing them out, not allowing them to have their own way, not allowing them to challenge their view on things. And that's, symbolic of the situation we find ourselves in. But we also know from the world of parenting is that we can go too far like that, but also you can go the other way where it's too laissez-faire, too relaxed, and as a result, that can cause problems. And if you bring that back to the world we're in right now, many of those that recognize that what we're facing here is, whilst we do have a problem with the virus, we actually have many of the responses that we've seen are about power and control. Money, power, and control. And as a result of that, money and power are guiding forces. So think about this. there's many industries that are profiting in an incredible way, making millions or billions off the back of the coronavirus. Whether that's those in the digital identification industry, whether it's those in the pharmaceutical industry and many other industries that have profited significantly from this. They are gaining right now from the status quo. They are gaining from the narrative. So quite clearly, they are playing an enormous effect on lobbying and upholding the status quo, including big tech that are behind many of the social platforms. Hence, we're seeing such widespread censorship. So we have this influence, but we also have industries that are hard hit and groups of society that are hard hit, who on the other side of that have an incentive to challenge the status quo. So what's really important for us to recognize is if money and power are guiding this, then potentially it's about finding different ways to use those forces of money and power in order to tackle the problems. So that's why I bring up the industries that are hard hit by this, because they have an enormous weight of force economically, whether that's travel, hospitality, entertainment, in challenging policy, because they too have weight. So activism on one hand is important. Legal challenges is another way to tackle social issues and political issues. But of course, the final and most important really is about looking at ways to engage the public in challenging these issues. And beyond that, it's getting creative in terms of how we actually solve these bigger, broader issues. Because in a world where the kind of media is controlled and the political messages are controlled, we end up in a sense of where there's this homogenous society. Nietzsche, the philosopher, has written about this and the dangers of having a society that thinks the same and sees the world in the same way. Ultimately, throughout history, it's been the creatives, the disruptors, the innovators, the free thinkers, the critical thinkers are the ones that see the problems in the world, spot the patterns, and disrupt the status quo and challenge the status quo. Without that, we don't have solutions. But that power is within all of us to understand how we can use that creative energy to start to look at solutions. So it begins with clearly identifying what the problems are, and if we can, get to the root cause, and then look at what are the solutions. Now, in the context of government intervention, that's a tricky one, because, as I mentioned, you can go too far, excess intervention, but you can go too far the other way. I mentioned money and power and control because many of those companies that are gaining from this have influence over the government. And if we don't have a strong enough government, ultimately, one of the government's roles is to regulate big business. Now, when I grew up in the 80s and 90s, the Monopolies Commission in the days of bricks and mortar business played a strong role to make sure that no business got too large, that they had too much influence over the market or society or government. But right now, in the world that we live in, you've got the Amazons of the world, the Googles, etc., Facebooks, who have enormous influence over the world. Enormous influence. And where the trajectory of technology is going through AI and all these different other developments, these companies are the ones that hold the bulk of the technology and investment in these areas. So if there isn't sufficient government, there's an under-functional government, all of a sudden these big businesses, whether it's big pharma, big tech, can start to outgrow government control. So in terms of the big problem, we have a short-term problem in terms of the issues that are coming as a result of policy coming from governments. But we also have the issue of what should government look like if we were to rebuild it from the ground up to help represent the interests of the people and the planet, but also to keep private interests in check when they could potentially disrupt democracy, disrupt freedoms, disrupt society. So the government obviously still needs to play a role, but what role it should play? And is there too much centralization? Should it be decentralized? What role should it play? All of these things are interesting problems to solve. They don't solve the immediate issues that we're facing, but ultimately it's one of those things where when we look at solutions, we've got the short-term issues that we can resist, tackle, but actually many of these problems have arisen because there's a root problem that requires tackling. So now it's time for us to get really creative, understand what the key issues are, and start to think about real solutions. What I want to bring to the podcast in the coming weeks and months is ideas not only how we can tackle each of these individual issues from a point of resistance, but actually how we can get to the root cause and start to solve those issues. And beyond that, when people are worried about their children, for instance, going back to school in September, how can we help those parents to deal with those issues, and what solutions are available? So I believe we have all the answers within us, and I believe we have the creativity and power to affect change. So I really want to play a part as we go forward from here, looking at some of those solutions. So right now, I'm talking conceptually, we're not getting into specifics, but just as a starter for 10 on a Friday, start to think about what are the core issues that stand out to you? What are the root causes? And then how can you play a part in starting to formulate some of the solutions? What can you do on a local level? What can you do on an individual level? Because ultimately, money and power is driving this, power and control. Now, money and power can be used for good. And in many ways, if we become financially independent, we become self-sufficient, we become empowered in our own ways, then we have abilities to move outside of the system and start to look at how we can influence change in other ways. So there's self-empowerment, there's spiritual evolution, and then there's practical solutions. There's lots of things to look at. There's lots of things that we can explore. But I really look forward to exploring these big questions and looking at what the root cause issues are and then how we move things forward. So I just wanted to put that there tonight as a kind of thought for you to take into the weekend. How can we begin to solve the problems that we're facing? Because we understand what some of the problems are. We have to get to the root cause, and then we start getting creative about how we solve them. So I'll leave that there. Have a wonderful weekend. Please do subscribe to the Pandemic Podcast. You can do that by going to danjgregory.com/pandemic. And please, if you haven't done so already, please do join the Together Declaration. Go to togetherdeclaration.org. Please sign and share. Say no to vaccine passports. And together we can advocate for a free, fair and open society. Have a wonderful week.